Welcome to the HiRSE Seminar Series on Research Software Engineering in Helmholtz and beyond.
Thank you for inviting me. So today I'll be talking a little bit, I'm mostly taking the talk that I did in 2023 and presenting it here again. And I'm just going to be presenting about an example of modularity in software-hardware interaction for experimental physics, in particular about my work at the Max Planck Institute in quantum optics back in 2022, 2021, 2022. Right. So I guess just to kind of get a feel, maybe some of you guys here have worked in experimental physics before, and maybe some of you guys have even written code to run their own experiments. And I guess in experimental physics is actually quite common. And for people who have had to write code for experimental physics before, then code like this might look really familiar. And unfortunately, these code kind of still exists and is commonplace today in experimental physics. They are often written hastily, used one time, and never to see the light of day again. And in fact, I was the one who wrote this code for my bachelor thesis, like while I was doing my bachelor thesis. And this was, I had to look back at it a couple of weeks later, and I was just like really hitting myself, I don't know what I was doing. I guess I can kind of figure out what's happening, but it's just a kind of a bit of a mess. But I guess, does it have to be this way? Well, if I'm here, the answer to that is probably no, we can do better. So let's take a look at this code, right? It's clean, it's short. But what if we want to do more? What if we want to do more than what we have here? So of course we can extend it. We can do more. And what we see is that this code is clean, it's readable, and it's also short, which makes your life so much easier. And the truth is, over the many years that I've worked in experimental physics, which is I think basically my entire bachelor's and before that, the truth is software-hardware interaction is actually essential due to the complexity of experiments, the analysis, and often the monotonicity of characterization task that we have to go through, especially in quantum physics, where every little thing matters. So we have to characterize our setup. And often this can be really annoying, can be really, frustrating. And the thing is, this usually leads to a couple of outcomes for experimental physicists. That either you do the manual labor, compared to automation, you really just sit down and you do it. Or, if it's really horrible and automation is absolutely necessary, then you tend to write one-time use code. You tend to, just write something. If it works, it works, And if and when, I don't know, another master student comes along and then they have to look at the code again, or if you have to look at the code again and use it again in a year, well, you kind of just struggle. And that's what happens most of the time. And on top of that, we have some unique problems, I guess, to experimental physics that may or may not find resonance in this crowd. But we have to deal with really old equipment, right? These equipment that we use in lab, they are old, they are passed down generations, they haven't spoiled, so we're still using them. And who still remembers ActiveX? That was really from 20 years ago, where Microsoft first started doing this their version of modularity. And it really does not work well with modern programming languages. And I wish they gave a memo on that, because I struggled really hard. And on top of that, we have differing standards across the industry. So different labs, in different areas will use different technologies. And of course, over time, industry vendors, they tend to improve themselves. And this also results in differing standards. And I guess the one thing that's really a bit sad is that that the results that comes out of the code is often valued more than the quality and longevity of the code. And I guess that's also common throughout research, and when it comes to research software engineering, that the code that we write tends to not be placed at such a high level, especially when that is not the main aim that you're trying to do. So in experimental physics, that would be doing experiments. So what is the aim that I had when I came into doing this project? Was to basically import and use to really reduce the overhead that people would have if they want to use this code and if they want to automate the stuff in the lab. And this is the project I was working on. It's called NanoSquared. It is one of the projects where I was lucky enough to had the luxury of kind of making code good and really making code in a way that is sustainable, extensible. And let's take a look at that. So the context of this project is that we were at that point in time ramping up our production of a couple of new experimental lasers. And so that means that we had to do repeated measurements of these laser beam quality factor. And so far, that's been done manually by scientists, so master students, PhDs, or even postdocs. And the fact is that these equipment lack readily available interfaces, which means that automating it is not so straightforward. And since we were working with a special wavelength of light, we couldn't really take anything that was directly off the shelf. So these measurement setups that were directly off the shelf. And what that meant is that there was a lot of manual labor. In fact, there was also a lot of delayed feedback because every time we take a measurement and we do the analysis, that takes time, right? That takes time to get analyzed and before the result comes out and, to do any adjustment to our setup. And that makes it not scalable, especially given the context where we were trying to ramp up production for use in new experiments. So how did I structure my code? I kind of broadly split it up into pure software classes and hardware interfacing classes. So in this case, beam profiler modules will only talk to beam profilers so that it only does like one thing, so like kind of separation of responsibility there. And I have the stage controller modules that kind of move my beam profiler. So what we see here is like a stage, and this beam profiler is then moved back and forth in order to measure the width at every point of not say at every point at representational points. And in concrete, concretely, we see that for every single concrete class, we have an abstract class that describes what they are supposed to do. So a camera would have one that maybe takes the width of the laser at that point in time, at that point in space. And if a new beam profiler is pushed onto the market that we would like to use, we could just create it, implement the methods, and it is plug and play. It's infinitely extensible. And we do that as well for the controller, which needs a bit more configuration, simply because you can have stages with the same controller, but with different lengths. And on top of that, we had our pure software classes, which really did most of the fitting and things like that. And then we combine all of these into user scripts, and that would take all these individual components and orchestrate them into one big experimental procedure that can be done again and again with consistency. And on top of that, I also implemented a command line app so that it's a bit more user-friendly for the rest of my colleagues. And of course, in experimental physics, we want to know what's happening at every point in time. So I also added a logger mixed in, which then goes into every single class. So they inherit it. And that means that logging is then made efficient and combined, right? So it's a unified method of doing it. And I guess some Python equivalents for some of you that write Python. So what does this mean? We have individually importable modules. There's clear separation. They are reusable, extensible. And we can do component-based testing, which means that I can develop every single component individually first, test them, and then put them all together. We can leverage the auto opening and closing of hardware interfaces using with statements in Python. And it's configurable, but very easily abstracted. So that really keeps our code clean. And the benefits we see here, if we look at a FAIR principle, is that it is really interoperable, it is reusable. And over time, this code lasts longer simply because it can be used and it can be reused. And it accelerates code development for future projects and automatically provides structure and helps with documentation. It's not perfect, but honestly, for us at that point in time, it was good enough. So some of you guys might know about Visa, and you might be screaming right now, oh, what about Visa? So it does speed up development, sure. But on the other hand, we have IDs without meaning, limited device vendor support. So some of the equipment that we use did not actually even have Visa support. And the commands are not obvious until we pour through like loads of documentation. And so it works great if you wrap it up in like OOP code, but in and by itself, it's not an easy thing to work with. and it's not something that really helps in people to understand what's happening. So it's been 3 years, 2 years since I presented this, and so far, well, we have had some external users, mainly to work with one of the Beam profilers, because the Beam profilers did not actually have its own Python backend. So what I did at that point, writing that API, actually helped some people, even external to our group, and there's some minimal maintenance in the overall project. But additional features were difficult ever since I've left the group, because access to the hardware is just contingent to making improvement to the code. And since most users did not know how to use Git, any changes that was done within the group, it's not something that I am highly aware of. But I mean, it's good. It's kind of still going, I guess, very slowly, but it's kind of still going. And what is the outlook? Or rather, what do I think? So I think code in experimental physics is much better now compared to 10 years ago. I've seen some of the code written back then. It was really not the prettiest, but right now I think people are kind of getting more sensitive to this topic, and really putting in some effort into making code that's actually more sustainable. But the problem is not enough people in our field value good code in experimental physics. So let's do it, right? Let's advocate for better code in experimental physics, write reusable code with modularity from the beginning. Because if you do it from the beginning, this time invested is pain saved in the future. And the fact of the matter is, modular software is not as difficult as people might seem. It might seem daunting at first simply because you don't know it, but it's in and by itself, the concept is really not difficult to understand. And it is just simply easier if we do it from the start. And coming from the experimental physicist in me, like I would like to say, really save yourself the pain and let's do it, right? And at this point, I would like to give thanks to my former group at LMU at MPQ, and also to DRSE for hosting the conference, and of course giving me recognizing my efforts and achievements. And also thanks, Claire, for organizing this seminar. So thank you for your attention, and write good code. So I guess we have a couple of minutes for questions before we have to move on. So if you guys have any quick questions, feel free to shoot out.
Florian is currently a PhD student in computer science at Ulm University, and he's going to talk today about flowR, which he's still developing and extending, looking for feedback, interaction, I understand. Yeah, go ahead.
So let's get started. So hello everyone, and welcome now to my presentation on flowR. As was spoiled, we'll just continue with the road to good code and better quality code now. And so essentially, similar to Yudong, I will reuse most of the slides that I've shown in my DRSE presentation, but I've extended it with new updates we had since then. And to just get started and get you into the context, I'm a software engineer and not like a theoretical physicist or anyone from the now more research-focused area. So I'm looking at this from a perspective of software engineering. And to get started, I'm focusing on the programming language R, which I think most of you should be aware of. But in general, for those of you who may have only heard of R or have never actually worked with it, R is a programming language that's used in research, usually for statistical computing, so to do your statistical analysis, to do your visualizations, data summary, so forth, and most often by non-programmers, so by people who are experts in their specific domain, who are theoretical physicists, who are engineers, so on and so forth, but who do not have enjoyed any computer science education or background of the like. And so when we want to work with that language, we encounter a plethora of problems in the real world. So first of all, it lacks something that's called a static analysis tool. So in general, when you work with a programming language, you usually get some support from your development environment that tells you this snippet is bad, or this doesn't reproduce, or there are some challenges here. And especially for R, these tools aren't as well supported and aren't as present as they are for other languages. Furthermore, R has many powerful reflective capabilities, which essentially hinders its analysis from the static analysis perspective. So in order to give you like hints and tips on how to write better code or to help you understand this specific code, these tools first have to understand the code themselves. And due to many of the features that R has, this is rather difficult. To continue, the language specification of R itself is incomplete, which in general means that when we want to write a program that essentially analyzes R code for us to help our developers to understand the code, we ourselves have to understand all of these details and minor semantics of the language. And this is even more hindered by the fact that like the language itself, it has a language definition, there are some explanations, but if you want to get to the real details and edge cases and so on and so forth, you essentially have to like explore them yourself and define them yourselves. And all of this is essentially just the prerequisite for the main problem that we have in the community and with the R programming language. It is that most of these scripts in the real world that are published, written in R, so on and so forth, simply do not reproduce. So there was some previous studies, for example, by Trisovic et al., where they essentially found that around 70 to 80% of R scripts, which are published in the real world and part of publications, part of reproducibility packages, and so on and so forth, do no longer reproduce when we try to like re-execute them on another machine. To make that even worse, they don't just not reproduce, they most often do not even execute because of some runtime errors. So there are many problems rampant in the language used in the real world. To make this more specific and to like dive into this specific study, we can have a look at a small example R script that's now taken from just a example background, but still represents what we find in the real world. We can find like a plethora of problems. Starting with the libraries, even though there are some solutions to do that in R, most people just don't pinpoint their library versions, which means that when you try to re-execute the script later, download the libraries with newer versions, they're either incompatible or they changed in behavior, they added some like edge cases or deprecated some functions and the script is no longer execute. This gets even worse with more subtle changes where functions still exist, still work, but their output changes because, for example, some default parameters changed within the code base. Furthermore, we often see hard-coded paths where users just like use absolute paths or in general hard-coded paths for files that either no longer exist or exist at different locations. And to go on and on and on, there are many more problems that we can find in the snippet here that I'm now shortening, but still where in general a static analysis tool can help you find them preemptively before submitting and essentially assisting you in writing better code. Furthermore, regarding this research, the second problem essentially is that these scripts are rather long. So while it's easy to find these problems as a human, these short snippets, it gets much more complicated in real world scripts, of course, because they can do some stuff up here that then in some other way influences more of the analysis down below. And you essentially have to grasp the complete script to know what's going on. So other research already tried to like explore most of these dynamic features of R, where you try to handle cases like eval, like the possibility to change existing function definitions, or just the stuff that, for example, ggplot does, like the visualization library in R, when it re-exposes the column names of a data frame at variables, all of which has to be tracked in an environment. But still, there's not enough tool support, or for these cases, there isn't any tool support, which essentially helps you to understand what's going on effectively. And so here we now are with flowR, which is essentially the tool that we are developing, where we try to counteract this problem. And the main goal of flowR is that you take your R script that we can see here on the left-hand side. It's very long, you don't have to read it, but it's a real-world R script and consists of many model operations. It creates several visualizations. And what you can essentially do is you can pinpoint one specific figure, you can pinpoint one specific model, and what flowR essentially does is it reduces the code that you're seeing to just the part relevant to compute this specific figure or this specific model. So it's essentially a first step to like untangle complicated scripts where you can take the script, you get an overview of what the script is doing, and you can select specific parts within the script to see just what's relevant to complete this respective purpose. And in general, when we do that on real-world R scripts, just like sampling for interesting points where users could be interested in, we see that already doing this achieves a reduction ranging from 80 to 90%. And the output script is still executable, given that the original script is executable, and the output script may even be executable when the original script isn't, because, for example, if you have your big R script and it's not executable because it's missing a single input file, it's still possible that another figure is still possible to generate, which doesn't rely on that data set, or in general, that there's a syntactic error that's now no longer in the code because you don't require what's ever depending here for generating that specific figure. And so this already can like help you in understanding what a specific script at hand is actually doing. Furthermore, based on this capability, we essentially created an extension that's directly available to the user where we're doing a lot more, because to actually arrive at a point where we can tell you what's required to generate a specific figure or to like do a specific model or statistical calculation, we have to create a data flow graph, a semantic perspective of the script, and using this perspective, we can give you a lot more. For example, we can present you with something called dependency analysis, where opening an R script, now this is a screenshot from the extension that I'm trying to live demo right after my presentation, where you can essentially see all of the libraries that the script is loading, all of the data it's importing, scripts it's sourcing, and outputs it's generating, like figures or tables and so on and so forth. And this can, for example, give you a first overview. And on the other hand, of course, the program slicing, where you can now select individual variables and directly see which parts influence that specific behavior. Of course, the extension can do a lot more. We are now just focusing on these two parts. And in general, if you want to check this out yourself, flowR is freely available. If you're using Visual Studio Code or Positron, you can go directly to the link and just add it right away. For RStudio, there's also a link which is referenced up in the slides. And now trying to switch to the live demonstration, I can show you a little bit more about what it's doing. Share. Did that work? Are you still able to see the slides? Yes. So I misclicked. Okay, so I'm just sharing my desktop then, and we're closing this. And now you should see essentially my browser popping up, where I've already opened up a Visual Studio Code instance. Now this would work with Positron as well. And I'm just showing you that it works in the browser to essentially demonstrate that you do not have to have installed anything. You can just like navigate to vscode.dev, install the extension, and then you can get right along using it. And so what do we have here? We have to get started, very simple R script where you can essentially have where we initialize a sum variable, a product variable, where we have a little for loop that sums them up, and in the end we output essentially these variables. And now we can use our slicer either by looking at the dependency view, which is essentially recognizing both outputs happening right here and asking it to slice for the specific dependency, or we can just go ahead in the code and mark a position for continuous slicing, where now whenever we do actual changes to the code, they will reflect in the produced slice. Yeah. So now, yeah. And in general, this is the one perspective that we essentially have, where you can slice for the code, you can see what's actually influencing the code, and you now just get the perspective that in this simple example, when we want to focus on the output of product right here, everything that relates to the sum is essentially unnecessary and can be removed. Now, of course, this is a very simple example, and for this very simple example, it's easy to track all of these things right away. But when we now look in randomly sampled scripts from the real world that were published, we can essentially see that, again, this overview shows you which libraries are loaded. You can click on them to see where they are loaded, how they are loaded. It separates between different ways that R is able to import them. You can see where the script is importing various data sets, and now the script doesn't produce any direct output files, but if we switch to one that does, okay, right here, for example, where it prints to standard out in a function, that's not as interesting as well, but still you can see what outputs the script is producing, what files it's importing, where it is importing these files. And then again, just taking this script, going to a, now of course, random line, but for example, considering that you're interested in this ANOVA test right here, we can just ask flowR to slice for this variable by right-clicking and using the context menu to slice for the cursor position. And now it's essentially reducing the program to just the parts which are relevant to replicate this statistical ANOVA test. And we can also go, like, for example, here, where they're writing a CSV file for whatever they are doing in the script, of course, again, to a hard-coded path, but then again, that was to be expected. And now we can essentially slice on the writing of the CSV. flowR takes a little bit of time to slice the file, and then it produces you here with the output of what's necessary to generate only this CSV file that we see here on the left. And now this is exactly the code you can find on the left here, with all of the lines that are unnecessary grayed out as well. And so these are essentially the main use case of flowR. You can check it out right away if you want to. And now going back to the presentation right here, I want to use the remaining time to talk a little bit about how we're actually doing what we're doing and how we're able to achieve these results. So to get the results I've just shown you, we essentially first parse the R source code, which essentially means that we get a syntactic perspective on the program where we know what individual tokens mean. And then from there on, we do a normalization step, which essentially removes any version dependence of the program. So it does no longer matter which R version you used when you wrote the program. We essentially get a uniform representation of the source code. And then on the source code, we do the most integral part, essentially, something called dataflow analysis, where we go through the program, try to simulate its behavior, try to simulate every possible runtime execution, and doing that tracking, what variables refer to, what function calls actually do, how the visualizations work, and what they imply. And doing that, we get something called a dataflow graph that is then usable for all of the analysis, two of which I've shown you today. For example, the program slicing, where we are reducing the program to just the parts which are required to do a specific thing, which is topped off by a reconstruction to essentially make sure that if the input code is executable, the output code will be as well. But of course, that's not the only analysis that we are doing. This dataflow graph essentially provides us with the required basis to do the dependency analysis, to do more sophisticated linting of all of the reproducibility issues I've shown you earlier, and in general to provide a lot of static knowledge to what the program is actually doing or can do when it's executed. And yeah, that essentially summarizes my presentation on flowR. So because my camera currently isn't working, I'm showing you a picture of me right here. So if you ever find me, just like you can talk to me and ask questions. And generally, you can find flowR on GitHub. We also share the code in Zenodo and so on and so forth. And you can explore it right away if you're interested. Yeah. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. And as well, I have to thank Claire for organizing this event. I want to thank the RSE for organizing all of the great conferences and doing all of this amazing work. And yeah, with that, we can go to the questions.
So our final speaker, last but not least, is Annalena Scheibler, the winner of this year's competition. So we've heard from Yudong, was the winner of 2023, and Florian, the winner of last year, 2024, and Annalena won this year, this February, at the conference for 2025. During her bachelor's and master's, she studied physics at the University of Stuttgart, and during that time, she discovered an interest in astrophysics and the field of extragalactic astronomy. And she decided to spend more time in research and started a PhD in astronomy at Heidelberg University. Her PhD project is a research software project where she started a new software from scratch with very little software experience. And she received help and consultation from the Scientific Software Center at Heidelberg University. And after a year, the project has already grown to quite a large research software for the community. So welcome, Anna. Please go ahead. We can see your slides. That's fine.
Yes, thanks for introducing me. And as you already heard, so I'm more from the physics and research side and with only a little experience in the software side. But yeah, with the help of the Scientific Software Center, we developed a software called Rubix, which is GPU-supported software to forward model observations of simulations. And I will come into more detail what this means now. Okay, so in astronomy, we have two sides which work on the same topics. For example, I'm interested in galaxies, and we have on the one side simulators, which run large cosmological hydrodynamical simulations and simulate how galaxies evolve and which physics take place there to get like realistic galaxies modeled. And on the other side, we have observers, which have like these huge instruments and observe galaxies, get great data and analyze them. And both fields are very important, and you get good results to get more understanding of galaxies. But the problem is really that they cannot directly talk to each other. So for example, in simulations, we have particles, stellar particles with physical properties like velocity, coordinates, mass, and so on. And these properties cannot directly be compared to observations because for observations we get spectra or images, which are kind of integrated light. So we basically count photons. And the aim of Rubix, of our new software, is that we can speak between both domains. And you can do it in the one way, which we call forward modeling, that you take your simulated data and forward model it into a realistic mock observations. Or you can go the other way around, that you take your observation and get out like the underlying physical distributions that you also can directly get from cosmological simulations. And we will have a look into both ways quickly. But before that, so for the cosmological simulations, we have a bunch of different simulations going on, and we have dark matter only simulations for galaxies and hydrodynamical simulations, which are dark matter particle simulations, but they have also the baryons, so the matter we know from our daily life. And we focus on these simulations because we need like the stellar properties to model our observations. And there are two different ways of simulations. So you can have a large box of the universe, which simulates a bunch of galaxies and run it all at once. Or you can have more detailed simulations that zoom in on an individual galaxy and model this galaxy. And we have support for both types, so for large volume simulations and zoom-in simulations. We implemented for TNG the support anyhow, but in principle, our code is so structured that you can apply it to any simulation that has baryons in it. And so which products we want to get, or with which observational data we work, it's very high dimensional data, because maybe you're familiar with images, like the nice images from Hubble and so on, which are beautiful to look on, and you can do a lot of studies. But also there, if you have spectral information, that is very helpful, because from spectral lines, you can extract a lot of quantities, the ages and compositions and so on. And now the best thing would be to put both imaging and spectroscopy together and get the benefits of both. And that's what IFU observations do. And we are focusing on IFU observations. So you can think of that you have like an image, and each pixel in the image has the full spectral information. And so it's a really high dimensional data where you can study a lot spatially resolved in galaxies. And if you look into the technical details, how they are observed, this is like the instrument placed at a telescope in Chile. So you can see a lot of cables, and it goes to a lot of spectrographs. So it's really difficult to get these observations, but they offer us a lot of insights. And now you can say, okay, such a software, probably already people thought of it, writing it. And for sure, people done it. But as you heard already in the previous talk, they're wrote by physicists, and physicists normally spend not too much time in thinking of software development. I think it's changing now that people get more aware of it, but yeah, they are just written down, and most of the time it's really a pain if you have to use them because they're not written that a lot of people could use it, or yeah, that it's easy to use. And we hope to achieve like an easy use with Rubik's, and we made the code public from the very beginning, and we hope that we followed most of the best practices from software development that we also learned from the Scientific Software Center in Heidelberg. It has a very short computation time, which is a game changer to previous software, and which is new, which no of the codes before had, it has GPU support. And with the short computation time and the GPU support, it brings these high-dimensional observational data or mock data into the field of machine learning. So let's have a detailed look into what the software does. And so the code structure, we try to keep it very simple so that we have an input. And then a linear pipeline that gets us to our output. And the input is deconnected from the whole pipeline so that we have a module that reads in the data and stores it in a uniform Rubik's data format. And then this file is handed into our pipeline. And that ensures that you can deal with a lot of different simulations. And then we have a linear pipeline where you can think of that each function is kind of a data transformation to our data, and each function has some physical meaning that is applied, and then we re-result at some point at the output. To mention, all these functions are pure JAX functions, which gets important for the inverse modeling later. But let's have first a look on the forward modeling. So I showed you the linear pipeline structure, and if you look on the physics, these are all the individual steps you have to compute to calculate a mock IFU cube. As you're most from the software side, I will not spend in detail about all these physical processes. I want just to highlight that these pipeline is built in the back, and then if you as a user do not want to modify it yourself or and just create a mock IFU cube, that's very easy. You have to just specify one configuration file where you say, for example, which snapshot from the simulation and which galaxy you want to use, and then some observational facts, which telescope instrument you want to use. And then the code you have to run to get your mock observations is just 2 lines of codes. And with that, we hope that it's quite easy for any user to use this tool and get its own mock observations. And if we format model cubes, I brought some different galaxies from the Illustris TNG simulation, and on the images you can see just the summed light or the summed spectrum, and at each colored dot there you can see the spectral information in this pixel. And this is a way to forward model the observations, so we get data products that can directly be compared to observations. But the new part and the game changer is like the inverse modeling. So to bring a toy example, I show it just with one pixel that we kind of have one spectra, just to that you can understand what the inverse modeling part is doing. We use JAX for that we can compute the gradient, which is the important thing. So we start with one stellar particle where we have the physical properties, and then we use Rubik's to forward model it into an IFU cube, which means that we get then IFU cube with 1 pixel, which is kind of a spectra. And we have our now mock observations, which we compare to a real observation or an observation where we want to get the underlying physics parameters. And for that, we to achieve this, we define a loss function where we use the cosine distance and compare how different are both spectra. And then we can compute the gradient with respect to the loss function. And with this gradient, we can then update the input parameters, so our physical properties of the stellar particles, and then run the pipeline again, and then adjust our mock observation to our target observation. And to show you how this works, so the blue spectrum is our target spectrum, and the orange is how you modify your input and then get very close to your target spectrum. Yeah, here you see the comparison. These two fields are the things that the software can do, so go from simulations to observations or the other way around. But I want to spend the second half a bit on what I learned from developing a software with no previous software experience, or what helped me there. So before I started this project, most of the code looked like very difficult when I looked 2 weeks later in it, as you heard already from the previous presentation. So physicists known to write such kind of code. But for this project, we tried to avoid this. And so we got help from the Scientific Software Center here in Heidelberg and got a lot of code consulting. And also the very beginning of the project, we used like the cookie cutter template, which allows us to set up quickly a Python package and has like a lot of things pre-implemented that you can get like a good code structure and also documentation and so on. And the second large thing which helped the project is the SSC fellowship program, where we got a year of code consulting where we sit down each month and look into issues of the code and also general things if we want to change larger things on the code or specific issues that we discuss them and get help from the software side on the code. And with that, we tried to follow also some guidelines for Rubik's. We used Python because most of the physicists are familiar with Python. And we implemented CPU and GPU support, which the GPU support is easily achieved by using JIX. We have a documentation set up, so you can just go to the web page if you're interested in the code. And then there's also our GitHub link that you can download the code and do your own mock observations. We did a bit of profiling in memory and computation time-wise, and we also implemented unit tests that we test each function each function that it's reproducing the things we want. We have continuous integration for that we check if each time if we push something to the main branch in GitHub, that it checks whether all the tests run on like different systems. And we have design patterns that the code gets modular also, and you can easily change things. And we have type annotations like here that we specify our input, what it should be, and also the output, what should get out, that we can detect if something goes wrong in early stage. And yeah, here you can see also some of that we do the continuous integration. So all the tests has to pass, and we also need to review so that we in the team are checking the code from each other. And with that, we hope to achieve a good code quality. So what does it mean? So we hope that the code is easy readable to also new users, and that you can extend it. That if you say, oh, I want to implement some external feature, that you can just go and plug it in. And that is mainly achieved because the code is very modular, and so you can take in modules and take them off or write your own models. The code is configurable, so that means that you can adjust with the configuration file, change things in the code, what you want to use or not. And with the same configuration, you should get the same results, so the code is reproducible. And yeah, with all this, the code is very flexible, and we hope to get a large user base for users, that it's very easy to use, and that this is a change to previous codes. And yeah, the code is public on GitHub, so users can open issues and say what they need, and also develop stuff and push it to the repository. So we hope that it's not our group only working on it, that people in the community find this code and maybe want to change it to their own needs. And with that, I come to the end of my talk. So Rubix is a software developed from astrophysicists to forward and inverse model the simulated galaxies and IFU data cubes. But with the help of the SSC, we hope that a project developed to a good code base and is not like a niche code which wrote by physicists and is not usable. So we really hope that with the code consulting and help, we developed a good code base. And so we also spent it therefore a lot of time in testing and integration and documentation. And so the software is ready to be used. And if you want to use it or have questions on it, you can also just contact me. And with that, I am at the end, and I want to thank you for the attention and also for Claire for the organization of the seminar and also for the RSE for the great conference this year.
Thank you for watching our seminar. Please check out the slides on Zenodo linked below and see you next time.